All right, just about the top of the hour here on New Day. It means it is time for your top news.
We did a lot of heavy lifting to encourage the military to move in a path of reconciliation. They did not take that opportunity.
A New Day exclusive. President Obama talks Syria and Egypt, why he says the U.S. hasn't stepped in yet, and how far he's willing to go. Plus, a first look at his plan to take on soaring college tuition.
Emotional reunion only on CNN. The school clerk who bravely talked a gunman into surrendering meets the 911 dispatcher who talked her through it all. The reunion you just have to see.
On a roll, the battle of the tech titans takes a dramatic twist. Yahoo now beating Google. Is Yahoo's new CEO behind the surge?
Your New Day starts right now.
This is New Day with Chris Cuomo, Kate Baldwin, and Michaela Pereira.
Good morning and welcome to New Day, everyone. It's Friday, August 23rd, 6 o'clock in the East. I'm Kate Baldwin.
And I'm Chris Cuomo here, as always, with news anchor Michaela Pereira.
Good morning.
This morning, we have an exclusive interview with the president. He's dealing with tough situations at home and abroad, so it was good timing for an interview. We covered what the U.S. will do in Syria and Egypt, how worried Americans should be about the NSA invading their privacy, and, of course, we get his first comments on his new dog, Sonny.
Which everyone wants to hear.
It's true. That'll be the highest interest.
That and a lot more to cover on that great interview. Then we're also going to be talking about Hannah Anderson setting the record straight. The California teen says she wants the world to know exactly what kind of relationship she had with James DiMaggio, the man who abducted her after allegedly killing her mother and brother. But it is her first televised interview, stirring up more questions than it's giving answers. We're going to talk about it.
And we have an incredible story of survival. A 51-year-old Florida fisherman thrown from his boat in stormy weather. He then spends the next 24 hours in the water, treading water 7 miles from shore with no life vest. You'll find out how he managed to survive while being stranded at sea. What
That
a
is an
story.
amazing story. Amazing story. Up first, though, the exclusive interview. The commander-in-chief has a lot on his plate these days. We caught up with him in Syracuse, New York, Thursday. We started with his college affordability plan, but he addressed major challenges abroad as well. We're going to bring in a distinguished panel of CNN correspondents to break down what the president tells us in the interview. But first, let's start with our conversation with President Barack Obama. All right, let's begin with why you're here in Syracuse, why you're doing this particular bus tour. What do you believe you can do to help lower the costs of college and give families who are struggling a chance to afford an education?
So a couple of things we're going to do. Number one, we want to create a new system of ratings for colleges so that parents and students know what schools graduate kids on time, are a good value for the money, lead to good jobs. The second thing we want to do is to work with colleges who are doing some really interesting things to figure out how do you reduce costs. Can you help young people graduate a little faster? And then the third thing we want to do is to build on something we've already done, which is to try to help students manage their debt. We've got a program right now where you never have to pay more than 10% of your income.
There's no question that the key to it is cost. The numbers are your own. Income 16%, college education costs are going up by well over 200%. How do you make them stop when they hold all the cards?
Well, when you look at public colleges and universities, part of what's happened is state legislatures have dropped their support. And so the universities, rather than thinking about how do we save money and do more with less, they just pass on automatically those costs to students. And we've got to put some pressure on state legislatures. If you are serious about training a great workforce in your state, then you've got to invest in state universities and colleges and not just invest in prisons, which is part of what we did over a long period of time. Now, one last element to it. Once we develop the rating systems, part of what we're going to argue to Congress is that we should tie in some way the way federal financial aid flows to schools that are doing really well on this and not so much on schools that aren't. So if a school has a higher default rate than it does a graduation rate, then we should give them a chance to improve, but ultimately we don't want kids saddled with debt. We want them to actually get a degree and to be able to get a good job.
But when we say it's a priority, if that's what you're going to say, this matters the most. This is the new reality for our economy is what you know.
Exactly.
You then tie it to the Treasury rate. You make sure that students are going to borrow at a rate that's much higher than banks get, right? Because our government is effectively allowing banks to loan money to whomever they want and borrow themselves at about 0%. Why not make this the new home mortgage? Treat it like that. Get the rates lower so that the students don't pay the most, more than banks, more than homeowners.
Chris, actually right now, because of the deal that was cut, they're not going to be borrowing at a higher rate than your mortgage. That had happened because Congress hadn't acted.
Right.
They hadn't done anything. Now, the key here to understand, though, is that the student interest rate needs to stay low. But if you're borrowing $100,000 and you're a teacher and you're making 35, then whether the interest rate is 3.5% or the interest rate is at 6%,
you're underwater.
You're going to be underwater. So what we need to do is to figure out how can you come out with less debt in the first place and keep those interest rates low. And that is achievable. But to do that, everybody's going to have to work together.
Families certainly need the help, that's for sure. Let me ask you about some of the emerging situations. Most recently, Syria. You've seen the images, you know the situation very well. Do you believe at this point you need to investigate in order to say what seems obvious, which is that the U.S. needs to do more?
Well, we are right now gathering information about this particular event. But I can say that unlike some of the evidence that we were trying to get earlier that led to a UN investigator going into Syria, what we've seen indicates that this is clearly a big event of grave concern. And we are already in communications with the entire international community. We're moving through the UN to try to prompt better action from them. And we've called on the Syrian government to allow an investigation of the site because UN inspectors are on the ground right now. We don't expect cooperation given their past history. And what I do believe is that although the situation in Syria is very difficult, and the notion that the U.S. can somehow solve what is a sectarian, complex problem inside of Syria sometimes is overstated.
But delay can be deadly, right, Mr. President?
There is no doubt that when you start seeing chemical weapons used on a large scale, and again, we're still gathering information about this particular event, but it is very troublesome.
There's strong proof they used them already, though, in the past.
Then that starts getting to some core national interests that the United States has, both in terms of us making sure that weapons of mass destruction are not proliferating, as well as needing to protect our allies, our bases in the region. This is something that is going to require America's attention and hopefully the entire international community's attention.
Senator McCain came on New Day very strong on this. He believes that the U.S.'s credibility in the region has been hurt, that a situation like Syria, that he believes there's been delay and it has led to a boldness by the regime there, that in Egypt, that what many believe was a coup wasn't called a coup, that it led to the problems that we're seeing there now. Do you think that's fair criticism?
Well, I am sympathetic to Senator McCain's passion for helping people work through what is an extraordinarily difficult and heartbreaking situation. But what I think the American people also expect me to do as president is to think through what we do from the perspective of what is in our long-term national interest. Sometimes what we've seen is that folks will call for immediate action, jumping into stuff that does not turn out well, gets us mired in very difficult situations, can result in us being drawn in to very expensive, difficult, costly interventions that actually breed more resentment in the region. We have to think through strategically what's going to be in our long-term national interests, even as we work cooperatively internationally to do everything we can to put pressure on those who would kill innocent civilians.
The red line comment that you made was about a year ago this week.
Right.
We know since then there have been things that should qualify for crossing that red line.
Well, Chris, I've got to say this. When we take action, let's just take the example of Syria. There are rules of international law. And if the U.S. goes in and attacks another country without a UN mandate and without clear evidence that can be presented, then there are questions in terms of whether international law supports it. Do we have the coalition to make it work? And, you know, those are considerations that we have to take into account.
You don't believe we've seen enough?
Well, this latest event is something that we've got to take a look at. But keep in mind also, Chris, because I know the American people keep this in mind, we've still got a war going on in Afghanistan. You know, we're still spending tens of billions of dollars in Afghanistan. I will be ending that war by the end of 2014, but every time I go to Walter Reed and visit wounded troops, and every time I sign a letter for a casualty of that war, I'm reminded that there are costs, and we have to take those into account as we try to work within an international framework to do everything we can to see Assad ousted, somebody who's lost credibility, and to try to restore a sense of a democratic process and stability inside of Egypt.
Doesn't have to be military, of course. I take your point, Mr. President. When you look at Egypt, it's an example of that.
Right.
Senator McConnell is saying, hey, I think it's time to vote on the aid,
right,
and whether or not you give it. That's
right,
a non-military measure that could make a difference.
You know, my sense is with Egypt is that the aid itself may not reverse what the interim government does, but I think what most Americans would say is that we have to be very careful about being seen as aiding and abetting actions that we think run contrary to our values and our ideals. So what we're doing right now is doing a full evaluation of the U.S.-Egyptian relationship. We care deeply about the Egyptian people. There was a space right after Mr. Morsi was removed in which we did a lot of heavy lifting and a lot of diplomatic work to try to encourage the military to move in a path of reconciliation. They did not take that opportunity. It was worth it for us to try that, despite folks who wanted more immediate black and white action or statements, because ultimately what we want is a good outcome there.
Is it safe to say that we have a shorter time frame now in terms of what the U.S. can use as a period of decision in Syria and Egypt?
Yes.
It's a more abbreviated time frame now.
Yes.
All right, we're going to have more with the president ahead. He's going to talk about the budget battle, the Republican Party, the surveillance programs. But first, let's go through what the president just said, because they're important issues, and we have key reporters with us this morning. Arwa Damon is a senior international correspondent for us, joining us from Beirut, and Jim Acosta, of course, CNN's senior White House correspondent, traveling with the president and Bingham to New York. Thank you very much for both of you being with us. Appreciate it. Arwa, let's start with you. I think the most important thing is the last thing that we just heard there, the timetable, that it's shortened now. What do you think the statements of the president will mean in context to those on the ground in places like Syria and Egypt? What will be the impact?
Well, I think at the very least there's this acknowledgement finally by President Obama that time is of the essence. The key critical issue when it comes to American policy towards specifically what's been happening in Syria has been its inability to take concrete action for a number of reasons that, yes, are very understandable. But one can also argue that if the U.S. was actually able to accurately read the situation in the Middle East and in Syria, we wouldn't be where we are today. It is very well known that extremist groups like al-Qaeda thrive in a vacuum, and that is what was created inside Syria. Effectively, the Assad regime actually played this game because it is, at the end of the day, a political, deadly game. The Assad regime played it very well. The U.S. has consistently failed to act in a way that is going to dial back the various impacts that the Syrian conflict is going to be having on the region. America at this point cannot afford to continue to watch from the sidelines.
And Jim, I want to bring you in on this, back to the issue where the president, you're traveling with the president. He's taking this 2-day bus tour to talk about trying to make college more affordable for Americans. You think everyone would agree that is something that families across the country want. But in talking about this, he acknowledges that he needs Congress to make some changes here. He also knows, the president, that his relationship with Congress is not a good one. So why do you think the president thinks it's going to be different this time around on this issue?
Well, Kate, I'm not sure that they think it is going to be different this time around. And you heard almost immediately yesterday Republicans on Capitol Hill saying that they really don't like this plan that's coming from the president. Marco Rubio was one who instantly fired off an email saying, hey, wait a minute, we don't need a college rating system coming from the federal government.